Hello everybody, and welcome to a slightly unusual format because today we have not one but two guests, and we're not going to talk about a ship that is gone completely from memory. It's a ship that a number of you will have seen featuring several times on my channel. It is of course HMS Captain, but you might be wondering, well, you know, we've watched this video, we know what happened, Captain sank, so what's so important this time? Well, for a start, I'm going to pass you over to our two guests so you know who they are, and that might give you a clue as to what we're about to talk about. So,
I'm Sherrod Cooper Coles. I'm the great-grandson of Captain Cooper Phipps Coles, RN, who was the designer and really the driving force behind the construction of HMS Captain, and he drowned with the nearly 500 others when she capsized in 1870, September 1870, off Cape Finisterre.
I'm Dr. Howard Fuller. I'm a reader in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton. I've been researching 19th century Anglo-American naval history for many, many years now. My research eventually sort of centered around the Captain story. My last monograph, here's a quick promo plug, Turret versus Broadside, gave a sort of long-term international look at the Captain story, why was the ship built. And we, for the past nearly 2 years now, we've undertaken a project with Sherrod's help to try to find the wreck of the Captain, which has never been found. We did go out at the end of August last year following some local Spanish fishermen, essentially, who told us where some wrecks were, and we indeed found the wreck, which seems pretty close to that of the Captain, and it is within the right search box. So that's what we're doing now, is trying to get back to that site and lower a camera and see if we found the Captain or not.
right, so for those of you who haven't seen the previous videos, or perhaps if you have, this will be a bit more information. What makes Captain of all the Royal Navy ironclads so special?
You answer that, Howard.
Well, as many of you will know, it's the mid-19th century is a period of profound transition and change. So not just political and social changes, but obviously scientific, technological changes, and their impact on ship design was probably the most radical that had been undertaken in centuries before, and arguably ever since, going from sail to steam and from wood construction to iron, later steel. Weapons themselves evolved from 32-pounders to monster rifled guns. So it is a period of profound change and profound experimentation. So, you know, just like today, we have the perils of high tech. You know, arguably we're still coping with the telecommunications revolution, for example. People back then were no different, and they were sort of groping towards what the future might have to offer. And HMS Captain's story is tragically a prime example of how the pursuit of power in a period of profound change like this could go wrong for various reasons. The story hasn't necessarily been told that much in naval historiography, as many of you will know. It's like we say, it's the most famous ship that you've never heard of. It's been lost in time, buried in more ways than one. So we want to change that. It is a fascinating period for myself. I have gone further back in history in my own research. I've gone forward. I think I've made it up to about the 1920s at one point, but I always seem to get pulled back to the 1850s, 60s, 70s. I still find just a charm in these particular types of ships. The beginnings of what you might even call sort of mechanical ships. They're ships as machines, ships that are built in factories as much as shipyards, that are employing cutting-edge technologies wild designs coming from all directions, some of which are extremely good and some of which are disastrous, all coming together, swirling around, and the whole process taking place internationally at that, and everyone trying to learn from one another, trying to avoid one another's mistakes, perhaps. So it is a wild period of warship design. The 1860s in particular, a lot of my research would be looking at things like the Crimean War, the American Civil War, where ships are built fit to purpose, and a lot of the purposes are far-flung and sometimes contradictory. Ships that are only good for operating on rivers, operate in very shallow draft waters, operating in the Baltic, ships that need to command the high seas, go to every corner of the world and back again. And it is very interesting to me. I often tell my kids that wild range of ship designs during this period is very much like Jurassic Park. You know, you've got all manner of amazing creatures that seem to be specialized in different ways, all clashing with one another, feeding off one another, surviving side by side and constantly evolving. So if there is a Jurassic period in warship design, I would argue that takes place in the mid-19th century.
So speaking of design, obviously the ship's designer is not unfamiliar with the way that warship development is going. He's been taking part in the Crimean War, invented some of the what we would today refer to, I guess, as prototype monitors, which is ironic considering obviously USS Monitor post-dates that war. He's seen the use of the ironclad batteries off Kinburn, and he's also invented the Coles turret, which in many ways is much, much more the forerunner of the battleship turret we'll see in the pre-Dreadnought and Dreadnought era than perhaps the Ericsson turret, which is a little bit of a technological dead end. But what was his general career path in the Royal Navy and outside of it, and how did it lead up to captain?
Well, Howard probably knows a bit more than me, but I'll tell you what I know. I mean, he was, by all accounts, a remarkable man. He came from a sort of landed family in the south of England, the Coopers and the Coleses. He was named after both of them. He served in the Royal Navy all round the Mediterranean, and like many naval officers at the time, he did the most wonderful watercolours. He didn't have a camera, but we have watercolours of Greece, of Algeria, and then he served as flag lieutenant in the Crimean War to his kinsman, the Commander-in-Chief of the British fleet, Admiral Sir Edmund Lyons. And it was at the siege of Sevastopol that he had the idea of dismounting guns and putting them on rafts, and he invented or created a raft called the Lady Nancy, who went close inshore and was able to bombard the Russian fortifications and swivel the gun. He then, after the Crimean War, like many officers, I think he was put on half pay. He had 10 children, and he became a sort of evangelist for this new form of fighting machine. And he was a friend or knew Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband. We have at home a bust that the Queen sent Captain Coles's widow after the ship went down. He knew Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who built the Great Western Railway, great engineer, of course, built ships as well. But allegedly with him, the idea of the turntable as used on railways and now put underneath a gun was developed. He was quite, by all accounts, a rather sort of aggressive campaigner, number of feuds. He designed a system of fortifications for the Solent. We have maps showing where he thought the fort should be around to defend Portsmouth, Pompey as it was known in the Navy. He lived there. So a remarkable Victorian polymath. And one of the many things I've learnt from Howard, and while it's been so fruitful, this cooperation between us, Howard is a historian not just of events on this side of the Atlantic, but the other side of the Atlantic. And one of the reasons why the captain had to have both steam and sail was she needed the strategic range to go across the Atlantic after the end of the American Civil War and defend Canada against a possible American invasion. The Americans had their own monitors, but as Howard said, they were inshore, what will now be called littoral combat vessels, the LCVs of their age. And Britain needed a vessel that could go on and go sail down into the Great Lakes and fight back against an American invasion, which never came. One little footnote, and then I'll pass back to Howard. I was for many years a British diplomat and was lucky enough to serve in the British Embassy in Paris. And I remember telling a French naval officer about HMS Captain and saying to this naval officer in French that she was powered by steam and sail. She ran à voile et à vapeur. And the French naval officers burst into laughter. And only then did I realize that if you say something is powered by steam and sail in French, it means that they're bisexual. And I was saying that HMS Captain was bisexual. Anyhow, over to Howard.
That's why I don't attempt to work my French. Well, going back to your question, the idea of a turret is somewhat different from the idea that was also becoming fashionable at the time, as you and many of your listeners will know, of semi-submersion, or what John Erickson called, subaquatic way of waging war. So the idea was that if you think about naval warfare operating on just a sort of X and Y axis, naval warfare arguably had reached its sort of peak. Warships could command that kind of horizon in all directions on a point of firepower and speed and the rest of it. But people were thinking about other ways of sort of attacking ships, moving ships about, making the most of the environment as such, and they were thinking in a way of a sort of Z-axis. And one of those, of course, would be something like submarines. The idea of using torpedoes or mines to attack ships from underneath, but also the idea of submerging vessels in the water as low as possible to give them what we'd call today a low profile, a low target signature. Today, of course, it's used mostly to minimize your sort of radar visibility, sort of cloaking yourself. But the idea of lowering a ship as low as you could in the water, even with the water washing over the ship, as long as you could maintain your internal buoyancy, it shouldn't necessarily sink. But that's also quite terrifying. And you're also asking people, well, where do people live? Where do they operate the ship? Well, they operate it under the water. And that's very radical thinking. It's sort of anathema to what everyone at the time would consider would be safe, practical, even necessary. So I have sort of suggested before, I'm not the first, in my look at what was going on, say, during the American Civil War, that John Erickson's ideas for the Monitor, the idea of designing a turret the way he did, combined with a low freeboard, probably would have never been accepted by the U.S. Navy, conservative administration as much as the Admiralty in Britain at the time, had it not been for the extreme emergency crisis situation of the Civil War going on, that his ideas were given that kind of, given an audience even. And there were other incidents with Erickson's career with the Navy, which didn't put him in good stead either. But the idea of combining the turret with a low freeboard, these are two different notions that are coming together. They don't really come together except in one prominent ship design, and that's the captain. A ship like HMS Monarch is a high freeboard turret ship. Now, that's taking a turret ship and saying, okay, we'll have a seagoing turret ship. But the Admiralty is only willing to give in to this idea. We've been forced on it by an independent committee in 1865 if the turrets are at least 14 feet out of water, which is about as high as the top deck of HMS Warrior. So they're not taking any chances. But that's something that Coles wasn't satisfied with because, of course, Erickson had presented people with this awful mathematical scenario that a ship that's that high out of the water or that large, just period, just that large, think about how much you could add to the armor protection, the thickness of its plating, if most of the ship was below the water and you reduced your target silhouette as such. You could maximize the weight saving into things like bigger guns with more hitting power or thicker armor plating over a smaller area that you need to protect. That's very seductive. It's very tempting. So putting those two elements together in a nutshell is kind of what started the long process towards the Captain's design.
Right, so of course, when we see Captain deployed, and one of the other hazards you have to think about with a steel, or in this case iron, steamship that also is powered by sails, is the masts tend to get in the way of rotating the gun turrets around. So Captain's design, as you mentioned, has this kind of low freeboard, but then it has a superstructure and a flying deck, and the masts are on top of that, so you can combine having your turrets with a big field of fire as your low down, nice thick armour belt near the waterline, but you've still got the ability to sail around. Captain obviously therefore represents something of a radical departure, even from the increasingly radical departures from established design that have been coming out in the past decade or so at that stage. What actually do we know about what happened to Captain when she goes out on her, what turns out to be her final voyage, and the area that she goes down in? What do we know about what happened? Because obviously, she went down with all hands, near enough.
Well, as with any sort of shipwreck, we don't know a lot about what happened. We only know what happened from the people who were in the squadron that night with the Captain. I mean, most of the major ironclads of the Royal Navy had been assembled off the coast of Spain. Channel Squadron, Mediterranean squadrons were assembled, ostensibly in a sort of show of force, given the fact that the Franco-Prussian War was going on. The nominal issues of the Franco-Prussian War was who was going to be the sort of ruling on the throne of Spain. France had a vested interest, Prussia had a vested interest. Now there's a war between the two, and people in Britain are scared. Things are very unstable in Europe. They have been now for quite a while. So a show of force with all of Britain's ironclads, including the Captain. So when the Captain suddenly disappears, literally in the midst of this squadron, practically in the middle of it, as far as we understand it, the way it was broken up into divisions that night, you have the testimony from all the people from the different ships. There were 17 survivors, 18 got into a boat, one was washed overboard. You had their testimonies. But that's only from their perspective. And their perspective is on a ship, it's in a raging sea, the ship is tilting, it's going crazy, it's at night, the wind is howling. All the people on the watch of that deck after midnight are basically swept into the sea. So their perspective is complete chaos. They don't really have a lot that they can offer as such to the court-martial inquiry afterwards, because they're very interested in trying to find out. You're asking a question that was asked exactly at the court-martial. What happened? What was going on? So the admiral in charge, Admiral Milne, he gave his account, but his account ends when he leaves the ship as it's getting dark that day, so 6 o'clock or something. He goes back to his flagship. There's an offer for him to spend the night in the Captain, and he thinks he wants to go back to his flagship instead. So he doesn't know, because 6 hours go by between the time he leaves and the time the ship disappears. And in fact, his report actually suggests that, well, we think we saw the Captain at about 1:30 a.m. It was astern of us. And someone in the Admiralty later on said, well, that couldn't have been, because the survivor said the ship capsized about 1:15 after midnight. So it might have been HMS Inconstant that had moved up next behind. That was the ship that they saw. But no one saw it. It was so dark. The sea was churning, the wind was raging. We don't really know what was happening. What they do tend to agree on was that the ship was still running some sail. This illustration here on the cover of the book is probably fairly accurate as to what kind of sail they were still running. It was up to the captains themselves to decide how much sail they should be set, unless an order went out from the flag officer to absolutely reduce all sail. But this is one of the mysteries about the captain sinking, is the condition of the sea that night. Was it a full-blown hurricane? Was it just a squall? Even the accounts during the testimony seem to conflict. It seems to have surged, and when it reached like a force 10, perhaps even pushing force 11, it quickly subsided again. But that was enough to tip the ship over. So it would be unlikely for the flag officer to say, play it safe, everybody burn off more coal, even though we're on a budget, and let's just get through the night, this kind of thing. That didn't happen. Some histories have also pointed out, starting with some contemporaries at the time, that maybe Captain Burgoyne, the captain, decided to keep the sails going just to sort of prove a point that the captain could weather it with some sails, that we were going to be just as economical as any other ship in the squadron, this kind of thing. There certainly is an element there that they feel they have something to prove with the ship.
I mean, another thing, Alex, which I hadn't realized until I read Howard's book, is, Captain had these strong tripod masts. She had new sail, and Howard says that every single ship in the two squadrons that night had torn sails, some had broken masts, broken windows, but because Captain was brand new and very strong, the sails didn't tear, and she keeled over. And Burgoyne was on deck telling the watch had just changed, telling them to get the sail down as quickly as they could, but it was too late.
And there was obviously some questions, as you said, they felt they had something to prove, perhaps because Captain had been designed and built by a commercial shipbuilding company, but designed certainly by Captain Cooper Coles, who was at the time, technically speaking, a civilian, although he was on half pay. He wasn't designing the ship as part of his duties in the Royal Navy. And there were questions about, was she overweight, was she unstable, and all of this kind of thing, which obviously, again, although there were calculations and tests done before she sailed, there are so few survivors and the weather conditions are so terrible that exactly what made her finally go is open to interpretation, I guess, until possibly there's something down there that might give us a bit of a clue. So fast forwarding to today, so she's gone down, it's the mid to late 1800s, and now what kind of started the interest in finding her again? Because there's a fair number of ships that have gone down over to the time, but relatively few up until recently have had their wrecks relocated deliberately. So what's the interest specifically?
Well, Howard has led this. I mean, the Spanish fishermen of Cape Finisterre have always said that they caught their nets on a wreck they called O Capitano, or El Capitano. And Spanish television, I think, got interested, the local Galician television. But Howard, you take up the story from there.
Well, I was doing a follow-up article after the book, and I was thinking that it might be a nice narrative framing device to talk about the shipwreck. And it had never occurred to me to talk about the shipwreck. I was doing a monograph. So I started looking, Googling the shipwreck of the Captain. And then I realized that no one seemed to know where it was. Maybe it hadn't been discovered yet. That actually surprised me, because in Victorian times, in 19th century naval history, the Captain disaster is probably the most infamous Captain disaster. You could have something like Victoria, Camperdown, things like that, but the casualties, the appalling losses, the bitter public acrimony and finger pointing, the intensive commemoration that happened immediately after the ship sank, the plaques in St. Paul's, as well as a stained glass window in Westminster Abbey. I just assumed that the shipwreck would have been found by now. Someone would have done it. And it took me a while to come around to the idea that actually it hasn't been discovered. There was a website called, I think it's shipwrecks.eu or something like that, International Shipwreck. It's very well done. And they had a listed wreck site for the Captain. But that was it. So I contacted them. And it was someone, I think, based in Belgium. And I said, can you just confirm that the Captain's been discovered and who discovered it and how did you place these coordinates on the map? And he basically emailed me back and said, it's just a guess. It's just a guess. No one's found it. This is where we think it's gone down. That surprised me. So at that point, I said, well, the ship needs to be discovered. The shipwreck has to be, it really should be identified now. This is crazy. Because as you say, given the technology in the past 30, 40 years, things like side-scan sonar and all the rest, the advances in submersible craft, the depths that they can go, the control, whether they're tethered or fully remote controlled. Look at all the shipwrecks that have been discovered. Mostly Second World War wrecks. You can get an American billionaire saying, I would like to find World War II shipwrecks. He'll do it. You can fit out a research vessel, state-of-the-art equipment, crack crew, and you can go out there and start basically scouring portions of the Earth's surface, or that is to say the bottom of the ocean floor that have never been explored before. But if you want to do it, you can do it. It just costs money. And they started finding all these famous shipwrecks. So you couldn't pick up a National Geographic, 10 years ago without, there's the Yamato, there's the Yorktown, all these great wrecks being found. Likewise in the North Sea, the Jutland wrecks that were found, stuff in the Mediterranean, the Prince of Wales and the Repulse in the South Pacific, or I should say, off the coast there of Malaysia. Wrecks in various degrees of deterioration, various degrees of documentation with cameras and mapping debris fields and sites like that. But the Captain, an absolute zero. It's only now, after getting a project together to get the funding together to try and go out and find the wreck of the Captain. Because fortunately, this isn't like trying to find Shackleton's Endurance in Antarctica, going into very hostile environments. It isn't like going down to the wreck of the Titanic 2.5 miles down out in the middle of the North Atlantic. This is just off the coast of Spain. And the wreck that we want to go look at with a camera now is still on the continental shelf. About a half mile out, it'll drop another 1,000 meters, it looks like. But for now, the Captain could be this wreck here. So it's not that particularly difficult. But again, it's only after doing this for a couple of years that the idea that no one's found the wreck of the Captain shouldn't surprise me to begin with. Because so little has been written about the Captain at all. I was telling Sam Willis with the Society for Nautical Research recently in a podcast. I said, Sam, why am I the one that had to write a book about the Captain? Why am I the first one to write an academic monograph about this ship? There are other cracking good academics and scholars, Oscar Parks, David Brown, who've written bits about it. Nicholas Roger, good article here, a couple articles there. But sitting down and writing a comprehensive monograph, no one's done it. No one did it but me. And it's like, I find that hard to believe. And it took the occasion of the 150th anniversary of the sinking of the ship for me to think that this would be a good story to tell now. I had to research. The story should be told. It's the 150th anniversary, commemoration time. But in terms of anyone even looking for the wreck as well, again, why us? Why should we be doing this and instead of someone else? Well, why didn't Bob Ballard look for the Captain? But we are looking for the Captain now. We are trying to write this. We are trying to fill this gap, shed light on this.
Yeah.
And of course, there are many hundreds, if not thousands, of descendants of people who are on the Captain. We keep unearthing them all the time. There's an interesting sidebar to all of this in that the Coles turret is still in existence on the Huascar, captured by the Chilean Navy from the Peruvians, still in the naval dockyard, naval shipyard down in Chile. And so, thanks to Howard, thanks to Wolverhampton University, we've got a charitable account, we're raising money, and it'll be a very exciting project, and Spanish television are very interested. And it connects in so many ways, as Howard said, with the history of England, the history of Britain's imperial ambitions, the history of technology, and then with some very powerful personalities. I find it very moving to go to Liverpool and look across the Mersey to the Camel Laird shipyard, still with Royal Naval vessels in it, but seeing the shipyard where my great-grandfather's ship was built. And where even at the beginning, Alex, there were doubts about stability and the freeboard was a few inches lower than they'd calculated, an awful feeling of foreboding. Yeah. It's got everything. It would make a tremendous feature film as well, including the final scene of Captain Burgoyne on the hull of the ship as she turned over and then unable to swim and drowning. And then, of course, there were many senior people had their sons as midship. It was the Royal Navy in those days was a very fashionable service. A lot of the aristocracy, friends of my great-grandfather from the Navy had relations on board. And then the other day, Howard came across somebody whose great-great-grandfather had been one of the Royal Marines embarked.
Yeah, one of our students at the university.
Yes, incredible.
Was traces a lineage to a Marine that was lost on the ship. It was even in my own classroom. And then I think it was in early January, I was contacted by someone in Tetnall, Wolverhampton, a couple of miles away from where I used to live, 2 miles away from the university, who also was traced a lineage to a stoker that was lost on board the ship as well. That's in Wolverhampton. This is in landlocked West Midlands.
Yes.
Never mind people based in Plymouth or Portsmouth.
Yeah, and I suppose that's a key thing to point out, is that this is a ship that still has a living legacy in the form of descendants of the crew. It's not something, with the best will in the world, if you go and see something like HMS Victory, I mean, there will be descendants of that ship's crew, or even potentially the Mary Rose, but with the Mary Rose, good luck working out that it was your great however many grandfather. And Trafalgar being 60 odd years prior to Captain, or just over 60 years prior to Captain, it's perhaps got a little less impact if you start having, say, great however many grandfather. How well does that person actually influence your life? Whereas, as you say, it's like Captain Cooper Coles, who's your great-grandfather.
Yes.
That's not very far removed from.
I mean, the odd thing, the sad thing was, he died leaving 10 children, and there's a wonderful passage in the diary, or a very moving passage in the diary by the Reverend Francis Kilvert, who was a friend of the family, and was staying on the Isle of Wight with the Duchess of Norfolk, who was also a relation, and Mrs. Cooper Coles, Emily, when the terrible news came in of the captain. And these children, including my grandfather, were farmed out. He was brought up at Arundel Castle. And my grandfather, he was an inventor too. He invented something called Sheridizing, which he named after himself. But he didn't marry till very late. So there's a missing generation. Most families would have, it'd probably be their great-great-grandfather. But Howard mentioned there's a great memorial in St. Paul's Cathedral listing every single casualty, and it's a heartbreaking thing.
When the ship goes down like that, and it's lost with nearly all hands, and then you go to try to discover the remains of that shipwreck, it's a mass grave. But the ship and the lives that were lost like that is also a time capsule. It's all those lives were suddenly taken at the same instant. They died horribly. They died fairly instantly. it was a giant black hole in people's lives at the time,
Yes.
and a lot of people never recovered from the news of that kind of shocking loss.
The equivalent would be HMS Queen Elizabeth or HMS Prince of Wales going down, almost all hands lost. I should say that we've been in touch with the Royal Navy. The First Sea Lord has been told. The Ministry of Defence, the ship is of course Ministry of Defence property. She is a military grave, and it must be respected. At the same time, using cameras to find out what we can will be very, very exciting.
Right, so of course you mentioned near the beginning that a wreck has been located, and you mentioned that the local Spanish fishermen, they seem to have this kind of folk memory that it may be the captain. And I know when we were talking beforehand, you mentioned that they were snagging their nets on it quite a bit, which I thought that would be very typical of a Victorian ship, because they're so ridiculously strongly built. I mean, for people who've watched the channel before, you'll know that HMS Warrior is still with us today after almost a century of neglect, covered in concrete as an oil jetty in Pembroke. How many modern ships you could do that to, and they still be in anything like salvageable condition? Great Britain was basically abandoned as a coal hulk in the Falklands of all places for nigh on a century, and she's still around. HMS Victoria, which we referenced earlier as well, while she's still on the bottom, she rammed the seabed and has stayed vertical. I mean, we recently saw the 3D scans of Titanic, which is another half century in advance, and poor Titanic's in the process of collapsing into so much dust, and she landed, in 2 bits, but landed on her keel. Victoria's just sort of sitting there, complete defiance of apparently everything. And obviously we mentioned tripod had these, Captain had these tripod masts. So the fact that a set of Victorian-built tripod masts are still around snagging everybody's nets to this day and not giving way wouldn't necessarily be the world's most surprising news.
No.
But when it comes to the wreck that you discovered last year, obviously that was discovered on a side scan, what is it about that particular wreck, other than the location and the folklore, that makes you think this has a very good chance of being Captain?
Well, I wish we had deployed a side scan sonar. It would have given us a more accurate reading, but we used a multi-beam. Now, the multi-beam will cover a larger area, but it doesn't give you as fine a resolution. It's at 500 feet down. It was giving us resolution enough where you could measure the length of the wreck and the width and the depth and get a general image of the configuration of the wreck. Now, we hit 4 shipwrecks in 4 hours. We had the film crew had managed to gain the confidence of local Galician fishermen who have been trawling these waters for generations. And a couple of them had basically worked out their own map of these various shipwrecks. Not just so that they could not snag their wrecks, but because I was being told this when I was down there last August. They said, well, they get good fish around these wrecks. So they even had it where they could tell you what kind of fish would be at one end of a wreck as opposed to different fish at another end of the wreck, and that astonished me. So they told us where to go. We didn't discover anything. We were basically, if anything, they've discovered it. We're just basically trying to ascertain what it is that they've discovered, one way or another. The first 3 wrecks were either too small, clearly from the scans, to be the Captain. They weren't even close. The 3rd wreck seemed to match the configuration and length of the Schwanek, a German freighter that was sunk in the 1960s and which was within a couple miles of where Captain is or should be. The 4th wreck was over 90 meters long, and that suddenly meant you've got now a big ship. What's a big ship doing here, first of all? Because most of the other ships are not, those types of dimensions. And we stopped at it, we went around it, and actually the measurements were within a meter of the Captain's dimensions. It didn't appear to be broken up into pieces and split apart like Titanic. Fortunately, it seemed that the wreck had righted itself as it sank, so it is sitting upright, as it were. Again, fortunately. It looks from the scans that it has a prominent foxhole and a poop. A lower midsection looks partially buried over, and a large chunky debris field in the middle. It could be part of a hurricane deck, it could be turrets, who knows. They also seem to suggest from the scans that there was some netting maybe on the wreck, and perhaps even some netting floating above the wreck, just sort of drifting around it. And that's going to be potentially problematic if we try to lower an ROV later, particularly if it's a tethered ROV. That's a question we're sort of grappling with at the moment. They seem pretty confident. I'm shaking in my boots, the idea of a ROV getting snagged in old netting like that. But there you go. This is, every shipwreck, I suppose, has its own unique perils, whether it's the Endurance or Titanic or whatever. So it's so close to the Captain. It seems like it could be the Captain. It's within a couple of miles of where our own research, based on a close scrutiny of the records and doing some plotting, suggested where the Captain would have sank otherwise. It was still within a couple miles. That we're in sort of a quandary that we can't just bypass this wreck. We can't just say, nah, can't possibly be the Captain. We have to go around it and something else. Even though it's an unidentified wreck, no one knows what this wreck is. It hasn't been identified. So we have to go take a look at it. I ran this past David Mearns, the big shipwreck hunter, and I shared some data with him, and he said, well, Howard, you're a rank amateur. I said, yes, I am. I am not a shipwreck hunter. I'm not a naval archaeologist. And he says, well, I am. And he said, I'll give you a 50-50 chance on this, and that's pretty good, actually, because he's very, the odds of you finding shipwrecks, a needle in a haystack are very high, against it, right? He says a 50-50 chance is being very generous. I said, okay. He says, and you're right. You have to go look at that. Now, if we can raise the remaining funds that we need and go back out there, hopefully by the end of the summer while the season still lasts and the waters are still the right color, opacity, they were telling me, in order to do clear scans and get LED lights down there, get a camera on there, and try to visually identify what we're talking about here. Because again, fortunately, Captain is a wild design. It's got some very unique sort of angles and lines to the hull and superstructure that should hopefully make it identifiable one way or another. Either it is the Captain or it isn't. Okay. But if it isn't the Captain, then we're kind of back to square one. Now, the Captain's going to be probably within about 5 to 10 nautical miles of this location. It isn't going to be that far out. My only concern is that if that isn't the Captain, we'll probably have to go further out to sea, and again, mile further west, you go off that cliff. And then you drop 1,000 meters, and then you're talking about underwater ravines, and as opposed to the Captain just sitting flat and upright, maybe covered with some netting, the Captain could be stuck in a ravine, it could be upside down, it could have broken into pieces as it hit all this stuff. It could be a mess, in which case we would have to do quite a lot of fundraising and then maybe call in a professional shipwreck hunter like David Mearns or somebody like that. I don't know. But one thing at a time. If we can get the funding together and we can go back out there, if we can go back out there and shine a light on the Captain, and it is the Captain, not only is it a lot of closure on this story, not only can we sort of close the circle on this in many ways, finally getting the ship out of the darkness in more ways than one. But it's, as far as shipwreck hunters are concerned and naval archaeologists, that's a hole in one. That was an easy find, all things considered. We got very lucky, but we don't know.
But, well, on the other hand, how many wrecks are there going to be off the coast of Spain that are exactly the right size and shape for the Captain? And fortunately, British ironclads didn't make a tremendous habit of sinking. So, to a certain extent, once the ROV gets down there, an identifiable thing that says this is a British ironclad will be confirmation before further examination takes place anyway, because the Royal Navy didn't lose any other ironclad warships in that area, and I don't think anybody else did actually, because the great era of naval fights off of in that vicinity.
I should add that the fishermen were saying that they're convinced this is a metallic wreck, based on the stuff they were bringing up from their netting. I said, it's a wooden vessel. How do you know it's not wooden? They said, no, it's metallic. And I said, okay. So yes, a large metallic ship is going to have to be at least after the 1850s, 60s, let's say. Okay. My only concern, I suppose, if it isn't the Captain, it could be some freighter, maybe something that was sunk in the First or Second World War we don't know about. There are a lot of shipwrecks off the northwest coast of Spain like this, just like there are off of Cornwall, the Scilly Isles. It is a sort of graveyard of the Atlantic there as well. The weather turns nasty. You need a lot of lighthouses because if you're not watching things very closely, you'll run aground. It'll be your worst nightmare. So it could be something else. We just don't know. It's very easy in this game, I've learned over the past couple of years, speaking with people who know what they're doing, to get very optimistic and saying it must be what I want it to be. Well, yes, we are going to hope, but we also have to be, just clear about this and focused and always assume the worst, I suppose. And well, we'll go see what this is, and if it is the Captain, great. Then we're going to continue fundraising so that we can then go back out there. Maybe if not this year, then first thing in 2024, and start documenting the wreck. So yes, let's start charting out the debris field. Then we unleash the proper marine archaeologists and let them do their job.
And what we'd like to do, we were originally planning in 2020 to have a lecture before we knew the wreck had been found about this to mark the 150th anniversary. That was postponed because of COVID. But the ideal would be in 2025 to present these findings to the world and to raise money for the National Museum of the Royal Navy, who've been very supportive of this. And we would have a big event, say at the Royal Geographical Society, and have Howard present on the search for the Captain, and others present perhaps on the context of the times. And my friend, Vice Admiral Sir Tim Lawrence, is very interested. He's very supportive, and he's actually seen the Coles turret in Peru. So we've got a lot of support from the Navy, but what we need are funds, not very many, not so much. I mean, we're looking for a total of about 60 or 70,000 pounds just to send down that initial reconnaissance.
And discussing previously, obviously some of that money's already been raised, but how can people, if they're interested in supporting the search for the Captain, where can they go to close that last distance so that we can get that ROV down there?
I'd say, given the money we've received so far and pledges, we're about halfway there. So one final surge is what we need. When the ship sank, the court-martial blamed public opinion for building that thing in the first place. That was rare. That was a bit of a shock. It's hard to get our heads around that kind of thing today, that you would blame public pressure on the Admiralty for building something they wouldn't have otherwise built. So I think there's something poetic here, that we are now going back to the public, to the people, asking for their help to find that ship.
And you can Google "Find the Captain," and it'll go to a charitable account. You can gift aid it. It's being run by the University of Wolverhampton, the Department of War Studies there. And as Howard says, we probably need to raise another 40,000 to get this first expedition down there.
Right, well, there will be a link in the video description below for everybody who wants to go and have a look. And obviously, hopefully get this expedition off the ground.
Yeah, there's different, I should add, there's different levels of funding.
Yes.
If you want to give 5 figures, you'll get more perks. We're trying to make it, good for people as best we can. I mean, there's signed copies of my wonderful book, okay, but I mean, when we have commemorative events, if we do, for example, one of the things I'd like to do is get a proper HMS Captain memorial at Cape Finisterre Lighthouse. There needs to be a Captain memorial there, a proper one. And we find the wreck, we can get it. You know, if we have a commemoration ceremony, someone who contributes to this project, helps us, becomes part of this project, you can come. You know, you'll be a VIP. You know, you've earned your place. You've given your money for the sake of your love of history. This is why we're all here. The charity is set up by the university. The university is already a public charity exempt by status. So we have a ring-fenced account. So any money that goes in, it goes into ring-fenced account, and then that's our spending fund. If you give money this way, you can also claim gift aid. You can get that money back. Big corporations that give money is sort of corporate tax write-off as well. So it's all above board. It's all clear. You know, there's, we have a clear mission, and we will be updating the website actually very soon now as well, just so that people know what's going on. The website's designed to give people a bit of history of the ship, our efforts to look at it, why it's important, that kind of thing. But for example, the people in Tetnal used to have an old Captain website, which now went defunct, and they shared all their materials with us. I said, can we put it on our website and give this thing new life? He says, absolutely, you know. So we're going to put all this in, including a lot of unpublished accounts from survivors, people who had lost relatives. It's all going to go on the website. And one of the things that we're going to do in terms of the university is, if we can find the wreck, we're going to go ahead with an application for Arts and Humanities Research Council application. Again, applying for public money to turn around and tell the story of this public ship, the ship that the public wanted, that they felt they had to have. And let's talk Victorian history here. So we'll see how it goes.
Well, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. Everyone, if you want to chip in and help us find the captain, well, as I said, links below in the description. And with any luck, hopefully, coming soon to a social media, YouTube post, BBC news article near you at some point later this year, with any luck, we may have actually been able to find it.
Let's hope so.
Let's hope so. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.